Someone typed a simple question into Grok, the AI chatbot built by Elon Musk's company XAI. What does the Ethiopian Bible say that the Bible on my shelf doesn't? The answer that came back wasn't a hidden gospel or a secret the Vatican buried in a basement. It was something both more interesting and more checkable. A real, well-documented, 17 centuries old Christian tradition that most Western believers have simply never been introduced to. No conspiracy required. Just geography, language, and history quietly doing their work for a very long time. This is the story of the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible, what's actually in it, why it's different, and why almost nobody in Europe or North America ever hears about it. Let's start with the number, because the number is where most viral claims go wrong. The Protestant Bible has 66 books. The Catholic Bible has 73, because it retains 7 deuterocanonical books: Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, and 1 to 2 Maccabees, that Martin Luther and the Reformers set aside in the 16th century. Eastern Orthodox Bibles, depending on the specific national church, run a little higher still, often including 3 Maccabees or Psalm 151. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church goes further than any of them. Its canon is traditionally counted at 81 books, 46 in the Old Testament and 35 in the New Testament, making it, by a wide margin, the largest biblical canon in continuous use anywhere in Christianity. That's not a fringe number pulled from a YouTube comment section. It's stated plainly by the church's own clergy and by outside scholars who have studied Ethiopian Christianity for decades, including researchers writing in journals like Ostkirchliche Studien. You'll sometimes see the number 88 floating around online. That figure isn't fictional, but it's not quite the standard count either. It comes from an older, broader classification that folds in additional church order texts and commentaries the church treats as important without ranking them alongside Scripture itself. The church's own working number, repeated in its official teaching, is 81. It's worth being precise about this, because the exaggerated 88 version is exactly the kind of detail that lets skeptics dismiss the whole story as internet folklore, when the real source number is already remarkable enough on its own. So compare it honestly. 66 versus 81. That's roughly 15 additional books circulating as living scripture in Ethiopian churches every week. Not 20, not some rounder punch a number, but 15 read aloud, chanted, and taught in a language most of the world stopped speaking 1,000 years ago. To understand why this canon looks the way it does, you have to understand where it comes from, because the story of the Ethiopian church isn't a European missionary story arriving centuries late. It's older than that. Christianity took root in the kingdom of Aksum, in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, in the 4th century AD. According to the early church historian Rufinus of Tyre, a young man named Frumentius, shipwrecked or brought to the Aksumite court as a captive, gradually gained influence with the royal family and introduced them to the Christian faith. He later traveled to Alexandria, where the patriarch Athanasius, yes, the same Athanasius central to the Nicene Creed, consecrated him as the first bishop of Aksum. Around the same period, King Ezana of Aksum converted, and his coinage, some of the earliest in the world to carry a Christian cross instead of pagan solar symbols, is physical, datable evidence of the shift. That makes Ethiopian Christianity one of the oldest continuously practiced national Christian traditions on earth, alongside Armenia and Georgia, and older than the Christianization of most of Western Europe by a wide margin. Ethiopian tradition also connects itself to biblical history even earlier than that, through the Kebernegast, the Glory of Kings, a 14th century Guizi text that tells how the Queen of Sheba visited King Solomon and bore his son Menelik I, who is said to have carried the Ark of the Covenant back to Aksum. To this day, the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum claims to house that Ark, watched by a single guardian monk who by tradition never leaves its presence. Whether you take that as literal history or as sacred national memory, it tells you something true about how this church understands its own identity, not as a colonial import, but as a direct continuation of a story that started in the Hebrew Bible. There's also an earlier, smaller connection worth naming honestly. The Ethiopian court official baptized by the Apostle Philip in Acts chapter 8, while reading the prophet Isaiah on the road from Jerusalem to Gaza. That account predates Aksum's official conversion by 3 centuries, and Ethiopian tradition remembers him as an early link between Ethiopia and the Christian story. Though scholars are careful to note that the text itself doesn't claim he founded the later church at Aksum. It's a meaningful thread, not a founding document. Because Aksum sat behind the Red Sea, the highlands, and long stretches of desert, it developed largely outside the reach of the councils and creeds being hammered out in Rome, Constantinople, and Alexandria. After the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD split Christianity over the nature of Christ, the Ethiopian Church aligned with the Oriental Orthodox Communion, alongside the Coptic, Syriac, and Armenian churches, and drifted even further from later Western theological development. Its scripture was translated early into Guizi, the classical liturgical language of the region, and its canon simply froze in a broader shape than the one that eventually became standard in Europe. It didn't add books later. It just never got around to trimming the list the way other traditions eventually did. So what are these additional texts people are talking about? Is the one that gets the most attention, and for good reason. It's an apocalyptic Jewish text, likely composed in stages between roughly 300 BC and the turn of the era, built around the story in Genesis 6 of sons of God, read by many ancient interpreters as rebellious angels, who descend, take human wives, and father a race of giants. The book describes their judgment, along with visions of the heavens, the movements of the sun and moon, and a final reckoning for the wicked. Enoch wasn't a fringe curiosity to the earliest Christians. It's directly quoted in the New Testament book of Jude, verses 14 to 15, which cites Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesying about the Lord coming with 10,000 of his holy ones to execute judgment. A passage lifted almost verbatim from 1 Enoch chapter 1. Early church writers, such as Tertullian, treated it with real respect, even as others, like Augustine, argued it shouldn't be treated as authoritative scripture. Over the following centuries, the Western and Byzantine churches gradually left it out of their Bibles. Ethiopia didn't. For a long stretch of history, the complete text of 1 Enoch survived nowhere on earth except in Guizi manuscripts kept by Ethiopian monasteries. European scholars only rediscovered it in the late 18th century, when the Scottish traveler James Bruce brought Ethiopian copies back to Europe. Then, in the 1940s and 50s, fragments of Enoch turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, 11 separate Aramaic manuscripts, first published by the scholar Yosef Milik, covering roughly a fifth of the text known from the Ethiopic version. That discovery confirms something important. The book Ethiopia had quietly preserved wasn't a regional invention. It was a real piece of the wider library of Second Temple Jewish literature, the same world that produced much of the New Testament's imagery about angels, judgment, and the end of the age. Is another. It retells Genesis and part of Exodus, filling in details the familiar version leaves out, an expanded chronology, additional material on the patriarchs, and a distinctive 364-day calendar that mattered enormously to some Second Temple Jewish communities, including, most scholars believe, the group at Qumran. Like Enoch, Jubilees also turned up in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls, in more copies than almost any other non-biblical text found there, evidence that it was widely read and valued in the centuries around Jesus' life, even though it never became part of the mainstream Jewish or Christian canon. Sometimes called the Ethiopian Maccabees, share a name with the books of Maccabees found in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, but they're different works, telling different stories about resistance to oppression and God's protection of the faithful, unique to the Ethiopian tradition. There are also expanded writings connected to Baruch and Ezra, along with distinct New Testament, adjacent material. The Synodos, the Fethanagast, a canon law compilation, and books of church order that Ethiopian tradition groups alongside its New Testament. Part of why the Ethiopian New Testament count runs to 35 books rather than the familiar 27. One text worth mentioning carefully, because it's easy to overstate, is sometimes called the Testament of the Lord or the Book of the Covenant in Ethiopian tradition. It's presented in its literary form as teaching delivered by Christ to his disciples after the resurrection. Scholars who study it place its actual composition considerably later, most likely compiled from Greek and Syriac church order material in the 4th or 5th century, not written down by eyewitnesses in the 1st. Ethiopian Orthodox theology reads it as an authoritative expression of apostolic teaching on church order and conduct, not as a rival eyewitness gospel competing with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That distinction matters. It's a real, ancient, and theologically significant document, but presenting it as literally Jesus's own additional post-resurrection words, freshly rediscovered, overstates what the manuscript tradition itself claims. None of this survived by accident. It survived because of an unglamorous, extraordinary discipline. Generations of monks in Ethiopian highland monasteries hand-copying manuscripts in Guizi on parchment for well over 1,000 years, without a printing press and largely without recognition outside their own communities. Some of the most famous sites associated with this tradition are the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved directly downward out of volcanic bedrock in the 12th and 13th centuries under King Gevre Meskel Lalibela, structures that are still active places of worship today, not museum ruins. Monasteries on Lake Tana's Islands and in the Northern Highlands, some dating back centuries earlier, held and recopied biblical and extra-biblical texts through periods of regional conflict, including the 16th century wars with the Adolf Sultanate that destroyed a significant number of Ethiopian manuscripts and churches, a reminder that this preservation happened despite real historical disruption, not in some untouched bubble. It's also worth correcting a detail that often gets overstated in viral retellings. The full 81-book Ethiopian biblical canon wasn't unified into a single complete printed volume in Guizi until relatively recently. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church publicly released a complete Guizi language edition of all 81 books together in 2022. That's not because the texts themselves are new. Individual books like Enoch and Jubilees have circulated in Guizi manuscripts for well over a millennium. It reflects something more mundane and honestly more impressive: the sheer logistical difficulty of consolidating a scattered manuscript tradition, maintained across many monasteries over centuries, into one standardized text. One more layer of nuance is worth including, because it's the kind of thing a careful researcher notices and a viral video usually skips. Even within Ethiopian tradition, scholars distinguish between what's sometimes called the narrower canon and the broader canon. The narrower canon is closer to what non-Ethiopian readers would recognize: the familiar Old and New Testament books, plus the widely known deuterocanonical works, also found in Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Bibles. The broader canon is where Enoch, Jubilees, the Maccabean books, and the additional church order texts sit. Ethiopian legal and liturgical literature, particularly a law code called the Fethanagast, states plainly that the canon totals 81 books, but historically only lists 73 of them by name, leaving scholars to reconstruct which 8 additional titles were meant to round out the count. That's not evidence of fabrication. It's the kind of small cataloging inconsistency you'd expect from any canon list transmitted by hand across many centuries, and many have documented these variations directly, which is part of why the honest scholarly answer to how many books are really in the Ethiopian Bible is 81 by the Church's own official count, with some genuine, well-documented variation in which supplementary texts fill out that number. This matters for a simple reason. Real scholarship on